No.
He wants a recording. I'll give him a recording.
Okay.
You send it to me.
And on his own.
Okay, so just by way of introduction, the plan is to go through pieces from an essay Rav Shagar published right after the Hitnakut, so in Elul. Hitnakut was in the beginning of Av.
No, it was Teshuva.
Teshuva.
It was the day after Teshuva, or the day before. It was like, they were like, let's pick a date that's going to make everyone feel that this is like a really important historic Jewish event.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of working on a bunch of his essays from right after the Hitnakut, and he has a really intense one from Teshuva. These are just some selected passages that I picked out from a longer essay. If anyone wants the essay, I can send it to you after this year.
Please.
We're going to go through each piece individually and talk about it. There's a structure and flow to this year, but they are also sort of independent. If you believe in the middle, we can do that. I'm actually not planning on doing 4. I decided it was extraneous. But I think we should just talk until people understand things and not worry too much about covering everything as much.
What was the actual Hebrew title of the...
Teshuva, והתנתקות.
Okay.
I don't have the section where he brings it, but he deals in the beginning of the essay with a passage from the Rambam, Teshuva, where the Rambam actually uses... Hey, Tobiah, how you doing? Me too. Great. Grab seats.
Actually, I'm going to use a bathroom for it.
I was just doing introductions. The essay originally is called Teshuva והתנתקות in Hebrew, and in the first section he deals with the passage from the Rambam in Hilchot Teshuva, where the Rambam uses the phrase "hitnatkut" as disengaging from the previous self. That might not be from Hilchot Teshuva, but he is quoting there in terms of disengaging from past sins and things. So we will we'll come back to that theme. There's people from a variety of backgrounds here. I'm not going to assume anyone's level of understanding. I'll try and make everything clear, but inevitably I'll fail at some point. So if you don't understand anything, just ask me and I will say it again. Also, if I mumble at some point, just ask me to repeat myself. Great. With that, we'll look at the first piece. First piece is basically background. This is where a short passage with him basically just talking about what the Hitnakut meant. I don't know about everyone here, but I was like 14 when the Hitnakut happened. The disengagement. And the disengagement happened when I was 14. And I definitely didn't get it. I was at a camp with other Israelis at that point in time, and I still didn't get like what it meant to them. And I think it's something I've learned a lot about since then. But I think it's very valuable to read his sort of perspective on that. I'm a big fan of having volunteers for reading things. Anyone want to do that? Read the first paragraph? Jesse.
The Palestinians, as they refer to themselves, don't just want us out of there. They want to erase the fact that we were ever there. They said, let's annihilate that nation, and the name Israel will never be heard again. The state buried the dead of the block twice. The first time when it asked them to sacrifice their lives for it, the second when it asked them to sacrifice their deaths, which had become unnecessary. The second sacrifice, the sacrifice of the dead, is exponentially harsher than the sacrifice of the living. With meaningless words, they turned the residents of the block from pioneers, leading Israel and making desolate lands bloom, into occupiers settling land that does not belong to them and robbing its residents. This scathing degradation, the second burial, is bound up with the loss of reality, a loss of feeling at home.
Wow. Okay, so just a couple of points. First off, I typed all this up and didn't really have anyone else proofread it, so sorry about the errors in there that caught you off. There's a last phrase, the loss of feeling at home in Hebrew is baitiyut. It's a phrase that comes up throughout Rav Shagar's writings, the sense of feeling of being at home, of being where you're recognized, where you're comfortable, where it feels familiar. And that's what disappears all of a sudden when everything that the religious Zionists think they know about the state of Israel disappears. That's what Gush Katif means to the religious Zionist story, Rav Shagar says, that there's a certain vision of Geulah, of the state of Israel as part of Geulah, and not just as part of Geulah in general, as like a specific project that we're working on, that we are making happen. And starting with the Yom Kippur War, but really reaching its sort of peak at the disengagement, there's a sense that this isn't working the way it's supposed to be working. That there's a sort of slowly widening gap between the way we think about the state of Israel and the facts on the ground. Yeah.
Can we take a step back? This is my first experience with Rav Shagar. So, what is his position generally on Israel?
In terms of politics and the state of Israel?
In terms of politics, in terms of his view of the place that, yeah, and Reshit Tzmiachat V'Latenu, and also does he have any concept of a Palestinian claim to the land of Israel, or is everything just the Jewish and Palestinians are, people who make our life difficult?
So we will see some more of that in the third piece, particularly in terms of the Palestinians. Just quickly in regard to his approach to the land of Israel, he's a very interesting figure in terms of how his thought developed over time. We have one of the books that was put out was from when he was Rosh Yeshiva for a year at Yeshiva Kotel in 1982-83. He was like 32, and one of the Rosh Yeshiva went on sabbatical, and he was Rosh Yeshiva for a year. He gave speeches once every 2 weeks or so, and then after he finished for that year, he left him to do other things. It was a sort of mutual parting of the ways. So some of his essays there, he talks about Zionism and things. It's incredibly Zionistic, and it's serving as Yeshiva, leading as Yeshiva. He was in the army, and he was in a tank. He, in some of the pieces that we taught in the early book, the early drashot from Makotel, he, beyond talking about the importance of serving the state and fighting in wars for the state or whatever, he's actually serving during the First Lebanon War, Muhammad Shalom Hagalil. That was it? Yeah. And so he talks about really struggling with the meaningless deaths that are happening.
I thought that was 88.
Okay, then I'm just wrong about which one it is. But there's some sort of war happening that I believe is in Lebanon.
Wait,
83?
82 is the first Lebanon War.
Okay.
Okay.
So he also there talks about the relationship between the state of the Zionists and the state of Israel and religious Zionists, and the way the Jewish tradition has always thought of redemption and the state of Israel and Geulah and things. And he says the Haredim were not wrong for seeing the Zionists as revolutionary and rebellious and things like that. They were correct. That was in many ways a radical change. And he says, and this is something that he says that they were right in seeing that, but also they weren't necessarily right to be rejecting it. He said it was definitely revolutionary, but we didn't have to reject the revolution. Where he does clearly struggle with the state of Israel and religious Zionism there is the fact that he sees religious Zionism in many ways as being satisfied with political redemption, whereas he sees the Jewish tradition has, at least since the time of Chazal, very much emphasized a spiritual redemption, and he thinks that in many ways the political redemption has overrun the spiritual and religious redemption.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions then?
Some, but maybe we'll come back. But I do have another question about the text.
Just one second, just occurred to me. In addition to Palestinians, he has in this first line here, it's the Palestinians as they refer to themselves, which I think can be read almost ambiguously, that parenthetical comment. It could mean, I've definitely heard it expressed this way, as like, okay, there's not really such a thing as Palestinians, even if they call themselves that. Or it could mean, okay, let's take them seriously. And they call themselves Palestinians, let's call them that. So my inclination is to read it a little more like the former, but it could sort of go either way.
So my other question about the text was when he talks about the sacrifice of the living and the sacrifice of the dead. So what does he mean? So he says. He says the sacrifice of the death is harsher than the sacrifice of the living. So that means.
So the sacrifice of the living is the people who gave their lives to settle and develop Gush Katif as part of the project of building that land. And they died for something. Their death was meaningful. Their death had a purpose. It accomplished something. It was part of accomplishing of something. And then, in the space of a few meaningless words, it lost all of its meaning. And there's a certain sort of play on the meaning of sacrifice here. It's a little more clear in Hebrew, where it's korban. Because korban means both sacrifice and victim. And so the first sacrifice, the people sacrifice themselves. But in the second sacrifice, they are sacrificed. They're victims of the sacrifice. And that there's an idea, a sense that like death is not as bad as meaninglessness, which I think you can argue on the individual scale, but on the larger scale of history and historical projects, I think there's something to that.
I mean, to some degree it makes sense, right? Because the first sacrifice is willing, right? You're willing to trade your life in order because you have this particular goal that you want to obtain, selling the land or whatever. But that thing that you are willing to trade your life for, when that's taken away from you, so that in a sense is worse than the first sacrifice.
The dead is the hitnatgut?
Yeah. The sacrifice of the dead is the moment when the state of Israel says, we actually don't care about the things they died for.
Or because I thought it was that, right, the living people who, like, go there and are, like, living in under hard conditions trying to develop everything, like, they're sacrificing their lives to this continuing work, and they would have died, like, having a meaningful death, but now their death isn't going to have meaning. It's talking about people who are still living, who are the ones physically there and who are leaving.
So he says the state buried the dead of the block twice. So makes me think he's talking about people who are already dead. But I do think what you're saying is accurate. That it was true for those who are already dead, that their deaths were meaningful and now aren't. The same is true of the lives of the living. The lives of people who are alive but have built houses and families and shoals and things in that area and can't. That's all gone now. That's an incredibly harsh sacrifice. It's the same sense of a loss of meaning, a loss of your frame of reference. There's some of this loss of feeling at home. The sense that you know how things are supposed to be and you feel comfortable there and you know how things work. You're at home. You know where all your stuff is. Home is the place where you can just go and you know you're fine. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think too much in order to get things done. You're comfortable, and that's just evaporates. So one point I want to make before we launch into the next piece is a little bit historical background on Rav Shagar. I said that the hitnatkut is sort of the peak of a process that starts with the Yom Kippur War. The Yom Kippur War is particularly meaningful for Rav Shagar, who seems to have been something of a depressive sort of personality beforehand. Was never particularly exuberant, but he liked to quote an Israeli author named David Gurevitz, who called postmodernism the depressed rebellion. But he was in the Yom Kippur War. He had been at a hotel and was called up to an emergency to man a tank up in the Golan. And his tank was hit directly by some sort of artillery or rocket or something. And he somewhat miraculously managed to free himself, but he was the only one who survived. And other people in the tank were his friends from who he was in yeshiva with. And he spent the next couple of months in the hospital, the Rambam hospital in Haifa. And so that was an incredibly traumatic experience for him, and he saw it as a trauma for the entire state of Israel, and the religious Zionist community in particular. But there's a very interesting story that he told one of his students. He had a student who was studying at the yeshiva he founded, Siach, who was, someone told him you really shouldn't be learning with Rav Shagar, who's kind of controversial and out there. And the student asked Rav Shagar why people say that. And Rav Shagar responded with this story. He says, I was hospitalized in the Rambam hospital in Haifa, and I had this realization that the Torah is also hospitalized. Just as I am all bandaged up, and I, at some point, need to leave my bandages, the Torah is bandaged up, and we need to get the Torah out of its bandages. He had the sense that the Torah, as it was being taught in the religious Zionist community, was very removed from reality. And that gets back to the way he sees this. He sees that's a broader statement than just in terms of religious Zionism, and the state of Israel, but he sees a sort of widening gap between the way religious Zionists think about the state of Israel and the facts on the ground. The story we tell ourselves about our state and our participation in it doesn't necessarily reflect the way things actually work. And he said this was an issue of ideology, that it just, we had these ideas that we were sticking to regardless of what happened, and then he has a wonderful phrase. He says where you have to put your ideas and your ideology to mifan hamitziyut, the reality test. If they don't stand up to reality, then it's just clearly not true. So the hitnatku, the disengagement, is for him a very intense reality test for the religious Zionists and their vision of the state of Israel. And it's a moment where the community needs to be sort of really reappraising things.
So comment on that, like if you look at Tanakh, for example, when there was, a Jewish biblical state of Israel. So at that point, if you look at how people dealt with political issues, through a religious lens, so they weren't. If you look at the stories, they weren't like looking at the Torah and trying to figure out from an extant text what you're supposed to do. There was an ongoing process of talking with God, and there were prophets and things like that. And at every step of the way, there were sort of like new things that you had to figure out what the religious response to the reality was, because you can't figure it out from first principles if you want to be able to combine them. And I think that's one of the major challenges, is that you're trying to take a religion which is basically frozen and apply it to reality when political religion is supposed to be something which is constantly changing.
So that is really the best introduction I could have asked for the next piece.
Okay.
Anyone interested in reading? That would be wonderful.
The greatest obstacle to change is, of course, routine. This is what Rav Shagar suggests in Or Teshuva. The stubborn persistence in a single opinion, supporting it even as the sin turns into routine, whether in regard to opinions or actions, is a disease that comes from being sunk into harsh slavery, which does not let the light of freedom shine with full force. This is not just talking about practical routines, but also something perhaps even more important, intellectual stuckness, the stuckness of the Torah itself. And the latter is even worse than the former. Okay,
let's pause there. So there's a quick change that happens here, where he quotes a passage from Teshuva about the need to worry about routine. That routine is what sort of lets you get stuck in sin. But Rav Shagar shifts after that quotation to being it's not just about being stuck in practical routines, but also when the Torah is stuck. And that's not just his shift. The ellipses there marks a very long quote from the Shemona Kvatzim, the uncensored notebooks of Rav Kook. The original is published in Orot HaKodesh, but it is a censored version. And this passage that he quotes from Rav Kook starts off talking about the possibility for new concepts of Torah and Kedusha.
Wait, so is that saying that the Torah is stuff, or our ways of understanding the Torah is stuff?
I would say that it's hard to differentiate those two. I mean, what we talk about when we talk about the Torah, that's what's stuck. Like when you say the Torah, that is what is stuck. But in theory, and what Cook's saying is that there is some possibility of Torah that is a greater, loftier, more divine possibility than what we have right now.
So Rav Kook doesn't believe the Torah given to Moshe Rabbeinu by God is the eternal Torah that will...
Rav Kook sees the world and Judaism and religion in general, and Torah as part of it, as a constant development and evolution. The Torah was given at a point in time when we had developed to that point where we could have the Torah. But there is a constant development towards the end of days, the Mashiach.
Even the Torah Shabbat, meaning not only would he say this about Torah Shabbat Peh, which is sort of standard, that sort of evolves, but even like the Torah Shabbat or fundamental categories about Kedusha and Tara.
Well, I don't know if he would necessarily say the Torah text would change.
No, not the text, but the meaning. The categories. Yeah. Maybe he's saying the category of Kedusha,
And so Rav Kook in L'Nevucha Hedor writes about the possibility for a Sanhedrin whenever that is reestablished, to make new drashot on the Torah, to re-understand the Torah even on a legal level.
Was he the first one who had that idea that there would be a subheader that changes?
Well, that's in the Rambam.
Yeah.
The Rambam
Oh,
talks
it's in
about
the
that.
Rambam. Oh, fine.
But and I know Eliezer Berkovitz talked about it even more radically than Rav Kook. He
Yeah,
doesn't be doing that now.
The Rambam says the Sanhedrin has the authority to do that. I don't know. If the Rambam
Yeah, so I don't, he doesn't ever predict them doing it per
Right.
se, but
You just say they
he
can.
does- yeah, it sort of assumed they could if they wanted to, and there's no reason for them not to.
Well, I mean, the classic problem, right, is that there's a rule, which is that you can't overturn a ruling of a previous Beis Din unless your current Beis Din is greater than the previous one in number, in terms of the number of people, and in wisdom. And if you also believe in Yoridat HaDorot,
No,
right,
but
that
that doesn't apply to Joshua
Okay.
because
He's actually right.
you don't have to
The Rambam-
overturn a rule to make a new drasha because you're not overturning a rule. You're just making a new drasha.
Yeah, it's like it's not a power play. Like the overturning a rule is about actual authority, but we are getting a little far afield.
Okay.
Do you want to pick back up?
With intellectual freedom and boldness, Rav Kook knew how to raise up the sparks. He identified the positive motivations that stood at the basis of the Zionist rejection of religion's traditional authority and internalized them, using them to improve Jewish religiosity itself. But we cannot forget that in his generation, the secularism of Zionism was threatening and created a sense of aversion as strong as that created in us by contemporary post-style secularism.
Keep going. Just do the whole paragraph.
Can we continue to use the tools for interpreting the Torah and history and the gift for understanding people charitably with which Rav Kook supplied us? Is not the ethical excess of the left, which so often seems to us like injustice, and one who is merciful to the cruel will eventually be cruel to the merciful, actually, like secular Zionism, a deeply Jewish revolution? Can we not hear in it the shofar of the Messiah? Can we not see disgusting globalization as a stage leading to the prophetic utopia, that day when they will all be made into one unit to do your will with all their hearts, and all flesh will call your name, all the wicked will turn toward you? In any case, the betrayal of Zionism, that is the disengagement, is no worse than the betrayal of Torah occurring in many areas in Israel today, and it also does not create as strong responses in the leaders of the religious community. One gets the impression that the religious Zionist community and its leaders has become set in its accustomed content and does not respond to Rav Kook's call to renew, to hear the shofar's call rising from the harsh judgment that we experienced.
So here he's like launching into that question of changing reality, that the events that are happening are this shofar's call, that this possibility for new concepts of Torah and Kedusha also applies to new concepts of Tzionut. And he is saying Rav Kook, for Rav Kook, like perhaps the most important thing about Rav Kook for Rav Shagar is not any specific thing he said, it's the way he was able to see Jewish language as broader than it had been seen before, including new concepts that it didn't necessarily include before. Rav Shagar likes to point to chofesh. Rav Kook is obsessed with liberty and personal freedom, not in the sense that we think of sort of liberty in today, of the government can't tell you what to do, but as the ability to really express your truest self and sort of live out who you are. That was a very modern idea that Rav Kook managed to see in Jewish language in a way that hadn't been seen before.
But isn't it like, it's sort of ironic to be using Rav Kook to say that? Because the idea is that the religious Zionist community that like he's saying that they're stuck with it when it's not matching the reality, like come from Rav Kook and like his reading of like the First World War as like this, like Nechama Gog and Magog and all of this kind of stuff and like
so
that's like where it really comes from. So
so that's one of the interesting things about Rav Kook and Rav Shagar's approach to Rav Kook. One, some people have suggested that Rav Shagar sort of moves away from Rav Kook as he gets older and moves towards Rabbi Nachman. And there's something to that. He definitely gets more into Rabbi Nachman over time. But this is one of his latest essays. He wrote this at the end of 2005 almost, and he died in the middle of 2007. And he's bringing here Rav Kook to make his point. So he's very engaged with Rav Kook. However, at this point, he's also one of the few people standing across the river, as it were, from the main Rav Kook camp in early Zionism, the Gush Emunim group, which really comes from the Beit Midrash of Rav Tzvi Yehuda. Rav Kook was a incredibly prolific writer, and he says all kinds of different things over his many, many notebooks and writings, and he has passages that are much more like this. So Rav Shagar did not quote it in this piece, but Rav Kook has a piece where he talks about a passage from the Gemara that deals with the pasuk in Zechariah about someone being killed, and the Gemara has a debate if it's Mashiach ben Yosef or the Yetzer Hara. And the Rav Kook's question is the sort of obvious one: how is that like the possible options? It seems like you're usually choosing out of things that are similar to each other. And how do you, okay, it's either the Yetzer Hara or it's Mashiach ben Yosef. And Rav Kook answers that Mashiach ben Yosef, as opposed to Mashiach ben David, who sees as a more global, spiritual, messianic figure, Mashiach ben Yosef is the Mashiach who fights the national wars of Israel. He says that as part of the messianic process, there is a necessity for the building of the physical state of Israel and wars to be fought on behalf of the nation. And that is all about nationalism. It's all about the nation caring about the nation. He says that the very parallel, the Yetzer Hara, is about caring too much for yourself as opposed to other people. And that the caring for yourself is important, but caring too much for yourself is dangerous. The same thing is true on a nationalistic level. Caring for the nation is important. Caring too much for the nation can be very problematic. Because at that point in time, Mashiach ben Yosef has to die. And that is what the Gemara there is getting at, based on that pasuk in Zechariah, that there's a point in time when the Yetzer Hara dies, there's a point in time where, potentially, Mashiach ben Yosef has to die. He doesn't say it's definitely going to happen, that nationalism will become too self-loving, as it were. He says there's a possibility, and if that were to happen, in order to reach the stage of Mashiach ben David, when there's a universal spiritual messianic era, you would need to have Mashiach ben Yosef die. So that's a voice within the teachings of Rav Kook that Rav Shagar calls upon in other places, and he is one of a variety of thinkers. Rav Yuval Sherlow should probably put on that list. Also, in some other ways, Dr. Tamar Ross, people who found voices in Rav Kook who were very much suppressed, might be too strong a word, but potentially suppressed, certainly ignored. Because the main approach to Rav Kook throughout religious Zionism has been through his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda. A little bit the Rav Nazir who put together Arot HaKodesh, but definitely even after the next generations, it all sort of followed Rav Tzvi Yehuda and his very specific vision.
But what about Rav Amital?
Thought in mind. Rav Amital is definitely different. I am not familiar enough with Rav Amital's thought to really comment on it so much. He definitely was more of a left figure and highly based himself on Rav Kook. Because he
felt found Rav Kook completely independent of Rav Tzvi Yehuda.
Yeah, he was very independent. And so he also has an essay that was I don't know, I assume he didn't write it in English, but I read it in English.
But the separation is right, because the translation is simplified.
So he there says, we can still call the state of Israel Reshit Tzmichat Geulatenu, but that doesn't mean this is, like, Mashiach is happening now. It means this improves the political and physical status of the Jewish people, which makes it something on the road to redemption. But it doesn't have the same sort of tense energy of the Gush Emunim vision of the state of Israel.
Can I ask you a question about this
Yes.
beginning part? I'm a little bit confused because it sounded like when he's asking all these questions of does, one second, when he's asking all the questions of can we not hear in the shofar of the Messiah, all those questions, that's not him sanctioning what was done. That's him now just trying to find a more positive twist in it. He's not saying it was fine that it was done, because honestly, maybe it was a step towards a more globalized view of like the world and whatever it was.
I don't know if he would say that it was fine that it happened. It happened. That's a fact.
Oh, I thought he was saying that it's about like the postmodernismness.
No, he's talking, when he says post-style secularism, that's a sort of Israeli term that didn't really happen in American discourse. The term went from just postmodernism to really post-everything. Post-Zionism, post-just caring about stuff. Like the contemporary Chiloni society is called Dor HaPost, the post-generation. Not necessarily by everyone. It's definitely like a religious Zionist discourse kind of thing.
In what era is that characterization of Chiloni society relevant?
Well, if he's writing in 2005.
Wait, so he's writing this in
This is in
2005.
2005.
I have
okay.
heard, he wrote this in L right after the disengagement. I've heard that phrase used, certainly by his students, but even by other religious Zionists in the last couple of years. Once again, it may not be an accurate depiction. It is a way of thinking about the secular parts of Israeli society.
It seemed to me like in this part that he was attacking more like the fact that he was attacking more like the lack of like universalism in the religious Zionist community. I thought he was saying like yes, the disengagement is terrible. Maybe he's saying the disengagement is terrible, but he's like, but it's not greater than the sins of X, Y, and Z. Like it was kind of weird for me that he it seems like he comes out in favor of the ethical excess of the West.
That's why I couldn't tell.
Right,
And then I think he quotes like that quote from the Gemara that Kahana uses a lot as like, and then he like goes against it. It was like,
Right, so that's why it sounds like maybe he really does think, oh, this is really bad. But now, like, imagine if someone was giving a shiur after some tragic event happens, that like they don't need to sell you on the fact that it's a tragic event because you already believe that. They now need to like lift your spirits, kind of thing. So like reading it from now, this point of view, it feels a little bit like he can't decide what he thinks about it, but I think if you view it as like he's talking to people who he assumes understand the like weight of the disengagement, then here he's like trying to. It feels like he's trying to like.
Yeah. So
find a positive angle
just to
on
give
it.
a little bit of where he's coming from, I met his wife once and spoke to her a little bit about the disengagement and things like that. He was definitely not on the right wing of the religious Zionist community at that point. He said that like soldiers should obey orders to empty houses. He was not happy about that fact, but he did not join with the people saying that we should be disobeying orders. However, his wife told me that he really didn't believe it was going to happen. Up until the last minute, he couldn't imagine that this was really going to happen. And so that very much added to the sense of trauma he had from this. What's happening in this paragraph is that sort of ambivalence of that he really does think all of these things, that there is something gross and disgusting about globalization, that there is something excessive about the ethics of the left.
What problem does he have with globalization? Like economic globalization?
He says, can't we see it as prophetic utopia?
So he does have some problem with these. And then I will say I think he is speaking to the religious Zionist community who has a greater problem with it than he does. But the question is, okay, given these aren't great things, what they happened, what now?
He makes them sound pretty great over here. Prophetic utopia.
Right, so...
Well, he said maybe it is prophetic utopia.
The ethical essence of the left is a deeply Jewish revelation.
Yeah, but he's not saying that not good. Necessarily.
Right, so I overall, I do think he's very universalistic, and he has another piece written. It was a drasha he gave at Yom HaTzmaut right before the disengagement, where he comes out much more positively for these things, for universalism and things like that. And then that's an interesting question of how do you have a universal state of Israel and things like that he doesn't really deal with. But here he's working with the given vision of these things as not good, and then they happened. Once they happened, what does that mean? Particularly if you're assuming God is in control of history. You don't have to assume God controls every little detail. Let's avoid that debate for now. But if you assume God is in control of the history of the people of Israel, then God made this happen. And once you're doing that, that is what really has to crack open your way of thinking about things. In the piece from Rav Kook that he quoted that I left out here. Cook has a mashal of a seed. Because before the seed can grow into new religious forms, growing and developing, until you can have some sort of new growth, the seed has to decay, has to decompose and break down. That in order for us to reach new forms of Zionism, in this case, we have to be okay with the unquestionably painful process of our previous vision of Zionism breaking down.
What's the betrayal of the Torah?
So he's saying in the case of the betrayal of Zionism in the disengagement is no worse than the betrayal of Torah occurring in many areas in Israel today. The secularism. Actually, I know someone who just made Aliyah and was recently informed that the majority of restaurants in Tel Aviv are not kosher. In which that person had a very striking realization that is a little intense to have made Aliyah to a country you think of as this like messianic event happening now, and then realize that it's not, throughout Jerusalem. It's not like Jerusalem from the river to the sea, as it were.
So he's saying there should be more kiruv?
No. He's saying, okay, so you think the Chilonim are terrible, but the disengagement is. I'm saying.
Saying the betrayal of the worst.
Yeah. So he's saying you think disengagement's terrible, but like look at how much other stuff is happening that's bad.
Yeah.
Well, it's also like Rav Kook redeemed the secular people.
Right. Yeah.
So just like Rav Kook could redeem the secular people, so you can also redeem people who are politically left-wing, but
Thank you, Toby. Okay, so we already have this vision of the state of Israel as part of the Messianic era in whatever sense. That's what we're working with. That has to somehow include this betrayal of Torah, of Chiloni society. And if you're okay accepting that, he's saying, you should be okay figuring out how to incorporate the disengagement into that vision.
I think also it's exactly what you just said about that person in Tel Aviv. That person came to Israel thinking, this is where Jews are and religiosity is, and then they were like, why are all these restaurants in Tel Aviv not kosher if this is where religiosity is? It's the same thing. If you're thinking, this country will protect the vision of what Israel's going to be, and all of a sudden they're giving away land, you're like, well, wait a minute, I thought that wasn't what we were doing here. So, like, it's really exactly the same clash. So it's about, if you're going to broaden your vision to decide it still is Israel, even though there's people who are not religious here, you have to then decide, okay, it still is for the sake of Israel, even if there are leaders who are willing to give away land. Like, it's a very fair parallel, I think, in that way.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I want to take an aside for a second to talk about what this means for Teshuva. Because he does frame this in an essay about Teshuva. It is, on like one level, he's talking about Teshuva for the religious Zionist community in its perception of Zionism. But he also is talking about on a personal level, individual level, leading up to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. What he's talking about is that degree of stuckness of Torah, but also of other parts of your life. If Zionism is something separate from the black and white halakha, that you might have to do tshuva in your understanding of Zionism, just in your general life, he's talking about the fact that your way of understanding things might not be all there is, in a certain sense. That the divine understanding might be much greater. If we said before that Rav Kook has this idea of Torah and Kedusha that are greater than and beyond the way we understand Torah and Kedusha, then he's saying you have to be open to the possibility that the way you have understood Torah and Kedusha and your place in life in general is not as great as it could be. That there's something that you have to be ready to hear. To return to the reality test phrase, that you have to be willing to let reality hit you in the face and really understand what it's trying to tell you. To give a personal example, I spent most of the last 3 to 6 years, depending on how you want to count, working on smicha, and I'm almost done. I was supposed to be done back by Shavuot, and I thought I was done, and my yeshiva gave me a whole bunch more requirements. You have to do more stuff, and I was in the middle of finishing up my bachelor's, and I was deciding to start a master's. I was really looking to maybe move in a more academic direction where I've been thinking more of sort of Torah-y career choice. And there's a real sense that I had to sort of go through of trying to like reevaluate this sudden need to be stuck in yeshiva more and stuck in studying for smicha. What is that trying to tell me? Is that trying to tell me that I'm really not supposed to be going in a more academic direction? Or is it telling me that if I stay in yeshiva, it's never going to go anywhere and I have to go, like I just leave now. There's no point finishing. That's not something I have an answer to necessarily. But the ability to like recognize that reality is sending you signals and be open to hearing them is, I think, an important part of Teshuva. If you assume that, Rav Shagar certainly does, that the way the world works out is a divine message to you, that you should be trying to understand what it means for you, the way things worked out, then you have to really, that requires a readiness to change and a willingness to be open to new possibilities that I think he's really trying to get at here.
Can I bring up a somewhat political example without being political about it? Just to like...
Just
You
know
can
that
try.
I'll probably
Okay,
agree with
why
that.
not
I've
be
started
political?
arguing.
So I don't want to be being political about it. I'm just, without choosing a side, I'm just saying that lots of, for example, a lot of Americans who voted for Trump and were really, really sure that he was the right choice for Israel and for Jews in America, were, regardless of what was happening, very slow to criticize because they had really decided that was the right option. And I think for a lot of people, the whole white activist march thing was really hard for them because the whole emphasis on neo-Nazis and the president not saying anything to in any way like disassociate himself with people who would do that made a lot of people who had thought up until that point that he was going to be really good for the Jews and really good for Israel and really whatever it was, all of a sudden think, well, maybe that's not true. And I think that, for example, like came as a very, very harsh reality that made a lot of people, whether or not it's true or not, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is like that came as a very harsh reality that made a lot of people who felt one way and were like kind of refusing to assess any of the facts the same way that like many of us in any political situation are unwilling to assess the facts because we have our opinions and we want to stick with our opinions. That like kind of in the way that the Hitnatut, whether or not you want to look closely at the Israeli government and say what they're doing is right for your vision of Israel, when it becomes something that's like really extreme, like a disengagement, all of a sudden it like forces you to assess the things that you are comfortable just thinking and not looking too deeply into.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good example, of exactly the process he's describing, of being open to sort of hearing the new facts and reassessing when you encounter new facts. I think it also points to an overall problem, which is that we're generally not open to the facts and what they should mean for us, that we only hear what reality is saying when it gets very extreme. If there's no other comments, great, we'll do the third piece. Anyone want to read it? Great.
We have to understand that in the postmodern world we are incapable of bringing a winning proof in this argument. However, this does not mean that our claim has no merit. On the contrary, this is the test of faith. It does not draw its strength from absolute truths, but from our choice and our loyalty to our narrative. The difference between us and the left is exactly the faith that this is our land, that our right to the land is ancient and immeasurably greater than that of the Arabs, that we were exiled from our land because of our sins, but we never abandoned it and we never gave up on it. Our roots run deep in this land, deeper and more ancient than theirs. She is the lover of our youth. We will never abandon her. You don't have to be religious to acknowledge this. In this light, the settler looks totally different. He is the redeemer of the land, fighting for his rights. This does not, of course, shut the door on compromises and painful sacrifices. We cannot ignore the presence of hundreds of thousands of Arabs that are unhappy with us, just as we are not happy with them. What matters is what justifications are brought for these compromises.
Okay, so I don't think I got it till like the third or fourth time I read through this essay, but this is to some degree a contradiction to what we were just seeing.
Yeah. What is this argument? What is referring to?
Which one?
When it says we have to understand that in the postmodern world we are incapable of bringing a wedding proof in this argument.
This argument means I think Zionism, the state of Israel, and the Jews' right to the land.
Oh, okay. Like the religious Zionist,
Yeah.
like general religious Zionist view of.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, this presents something of a contradiction to what we were just saying. If we were just talking about the willingness to reassess your narrative, the way you understand yourself and the world, etc., this is saying, well, dafka emunah, what faith means is to hold on to your narrative when you lack sort of proof for it.
It's like the opposite. Like here, it's like we have to be open to the fact that if you reality check and it doesn't hold up to reality, then your opinion might be wrong. And here it's like, no, reality shouldn't matter because you should have enough.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I feel like they're not contradiction. They're saying, right, because there's like, right, if we're saying that we have to reassess, Rob, a very specific understanding of how Israel is going to be like work in the whole like racial political like the ultimate redemption thing, and she's just saying that doesn't mean we should ever think of giving up on the idea that like Israel is an important part of our spiritual life.
So I think that's true on the like specific level of ideas, but the basic postures here are somewhat opposite. That what he's trying to encourage in the last passage we were talking about is a willingness to to challenge your beliefs and to be ready to like reassess them and let them break down if necessary. Here he's talking specifically about sticking to your beliefs, despite the fact that you can't prove they're correct in any sort of objective sense.
When was this?
This is 2005 still.
This is all 2005.
Yeah, it's all from the same essay. What?
I don't get the paragraph transition.
So the transitions are these are excerpts. They don't flow one into the other.
Oh, okay.
The resolution, I think, lies in first the difference between lacking any sort of objective proof for your argument versus there being like active problems with trying to maintain your argument, that it is contradicted by reality. And I think there's a space where you don't have proofs for your what you believe, where it's not contradicted by reality. That's the sort of space he's talking about, where what you're saying it still passes the reality test. You hold it up to reality, and there's nothing that's like, oh, that's obviously wrong. However, he's saying you can't prove it, so we use emunah, that's the ability to really believe in your narrative.
See, I find this passage problematic for the same reason that I find religious Zionism problematic in general. But I think that it's very dangerous to come to politics with a religious narrative and sort of rely on that religious narrative to define your politics. You should have values and you should have principles, but like politics needs to be discussed and happen, in the world, completely in the world of reality. And if you're stuck with these
you could, as he says, you don't have to be religious to acknowledge this. So this doesn't have to be this argument. He may be making from a religious perspective, but you could make the same argument from a non-religious
Also,
perspective.
it's hard to say what reality is.
From a nationalist perspective.
Well, he's using the term faith, but he's talking about politics. Like he's talking about faith in our belief that we have a right to this land, that our heritage here is greater and deeper. Those are beliefs about reality, but they aren't necessarily easily. They can't hold them up against reality and be like, oh, look, reality makes strong statements about these one way or the other.
Ownership is a legal fiction, right? It's not
ownership, in reality.
Rights to land are not something which are empirical. Those are
you could
judgments
about. You could say it's non-utilitarian, but it doesn't make it religious. It's nationalist.
Right. So he has that is, I think, a value. That's something that's a way of thinking about the world. That's not necessarily religious, and I think we all sort of approach politics with values like that. I think you've did some very interesting essays that are worth reading, presumably by lots of other people, but I've read ones by Walter Wurzburger, a student of Rav Shagar, who makes a good argument for religion as being not just valid, but it really should be brought into political discourse. because the people talking politics are religious. What he says is that, like, it doesn't make sense that, like, okay, you can only bring your values into the discourse if they're from specific sources. However,
American politicians, all of them don't have that problem.
Right. So, American politics is plagued by the debate about how much religion should be involved in politics and things. But his argument, Wurzburger's argument is, and I think Rav Shagar is really affirming this here at the end, certainly in other places, is that you can't let your religious values be a bludgeon in political discourse. They have ultimate authority in your life and your narrative, but that's not how politics works. So you need to be able to sit down at the table with people and talk things out. And that's what he says at the end. Like, we don't like the Arabs, but they don't like us.
Right. I would agree that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I would agree that coming from a place of, like, it always is very frustrating when you hear people arguing about, like, oh, but this land belongs to us. And you're like, but why? And they're like, because it says in the Torah. You're like, go try to argue that with somebody who doesn't believe in your religion. That's not an argument. Like, you can't bring that to the table for a discourse, because that's a basis that I believe.
Presumably the people making that claim, they're making it because they don't care about the discourse.
Or they just, but I think often people don't understand that. Don't necessarily understand.
They understand. Like,
no,
I don't think that's entirely clear, by the way, when we're dealing with the Arabs, who are a religious population.
No, it's true, but I'm just saying, like, I think when you're coming with I agree that when you're coming with your religious values, as if that's an argument, that's not going to be a way to solve anything, because you're not on the same page as anybody. But I think if you're saying, right now, the first half of the paragraph, he's talking to people who believe the same thing he believes. So in that sense, it's fair to admit to everybody at the table you're at, and we all believe that we have a right to this land because, we have, like, a greater heritage here, a greater claim here, whatever it is. But that's why at the end I think he says, but when we're sitting down at the table to compromise on that, we know that doesn't mean we don't have to have compromises and painful sacrifices, and we can't ignore the fact that there's, like, debate between us. Like, I think that's a very fair way to frame the argument by saying, like, the first half, that is why he is a Zionist. Like, this is what he believes in terms of why he thinks we should live in the country. But he also is willing to admit that that's not how you have that conversation.
But he is talking about the conversation, because he's talking about this argument. In this argument,
it doesn't have a winning proof.
Yeah, it's not a winning proof because you don't have a winning proof, but this still should be our claim. Right?
Well, it is our claim.
Doesn't.
No, it's our claim, but that doesn't mean
but he's talking about our claim on the other side.
Because
he's saying our claim has no merit. He's talking about our claim in the arguments. He's saying, yeah, it's not a winning 100% proof, but it still has merit. It still has some level of proof. It's not winning proof, but it's still a proof.
I don't think that's a distinction you necessarily make in terms of you either prove something or you don't. Otherwise, you're asserting it.
But in other words, it's an argument. In other words,
I don't.
He's talking about making this claim to the other side.
I'm not sure about that because, I was going to get to, if you go into the last line in that parenthetical comment, what matters is what justifications are brought to these compromises. The significance of our narrative, of what our claim is, of what the story is that we tell about what we're doing, is when we compromise, when we come to the table, whatever moves are made. How do we tell? What do we tell ourselves about those?
If he's talking about what we tell ourselves, why doesn't he mention the fact? Why doesn't he quote the first Rashi in Chumash?
I mean, why doesn't he quote all kinds of stuff?
No, I'm saying because when we tell ourselves, if you're a religious Zionist, has nothing to do with the fact that we have a connection to the land. It's God's land. God decided we're there. It has nothing to do with whether or not we have a connection.
I mean, maybe that's you, but I know lots of people are like, Abraham was here, and
right, because they're talking to the other side.
Okay,
no, when they're talking to themselves.
No, but also he has other essays where he talks about God giving us the land and what that means. He's just not doing that here.
Because here he's talking about what you say to the other side.
Not necessarily. I would assume he would say you shouldn't deny in discourse in political discourse that you think you have a religious right to the land. He might say you should say you think you have a religious right to the land, but you shouldn't expect that to be a winning argument. You shouldn't expect that to be oh look, this is you have to listen to that. That's not authoritative.
Wait, wasn't there one of the ambassadors to the Israeli ambassadors to the UN during one debate about something? He was just here and put a Tanakh on the stand or whatever.
I remember some story like that, but
Yeah, I was just going to
I
say
wonder
that I
why
think
we have a
it's-
Hazara problem.
It's like really, he's taking the postmodern, he's giving, because the idea of compromising, he's not talking about, the whole idea they're saying is there's no winning proof. It's very modern, it's a very postmodern idea, is that you're not going to have some like final answer that everyone's going to feel satisfied with. That stuff doesn't exist anymore. It's just a matter of like everyone believing kind of what they believe. And so at the end of the day, you're not going to have something that's going to make everyone happy. The only thing that we can come to is a compromise. This side's still going to believe what they believe, and this side's still going to believe what they believe. So at the end of the day, we're coming to a compromise. We're not coming to a happy solution here. So the only thing that matters, as I'm saying simply, is the justifications. Is that we all have to know our own stories, and that according to these stories, we have to be able to argue that the reasons that we're doing the things we're doing, which are ultimately going to piss people off, we're always going to be pissing people off because everyone has their own stories, is that we just have to have justifications. And I just like the distinction that he makes about compromise being the goal. And the goal isn't like some crazy, like perfect harmony, like winning proof that in the beginning that he mentions.
So he has, there's an essay that was published in Luchot Teshuva Lefot, it was published in English in Maggid's recent English volume. I don't remember, it's called Justice and Ethics in a Postmodern World or something like that. And there he deals explicitly with the issues of like pluralism and morality, and how can you have a moral society when everyone has different beliefs about what it is and is not moral. He deals with a whole interesting saga of a sociologist who, or maybe an anthropologist, wrote an essay back in like the 90s, an article in Haaretz, explaining explaining the logic of honor killings, and that sociologist was attacked for justifying honor killings, and he had to say, I understand why honor killings happen and the logic behind them. I don't think they're morally justified. So Rav Shagar takes that as his starting point. Is what we're looking at, just realistically, is we want to make a society where you can understand where the other people are coming from without justifying them, and where you can talk to the other people and via dialogue come to some sort of functional moral society. And it's definitely not a sort of utopian vision, but I do think it has that sense of this is what we can hope for.
Or it is, because here he's talking about is the pluralism not like the first steps to a utopia? Maybe it is. Maybe that is for him a utopian society, where like, of course, in reality, everybody is going to have their own opinions, but utopian society is where everyone can have their own opinions and no one can kill each other for it.
Right, I think the pluralistic aspect was for him more utopian. I think the necessary compromise that comes from that when it comes to like shared space and things, that's just sort of necessity more than ideal.
Does he believe that we'd ever evolve past postmodernism? Does he hope for that? Is that something he would like?
I'm not certain. He sees postmodernism much like he sees the sort of globalistic, universalistic push of the disengagement as a divine message about what's supposed to be happening now in this period of history.
Disengagement
Universalistic.
Yeah.
So it was a sort of step back for the sort of very nationalistic side of Israel. That side was lost. Versus the universalistic side.
Right, it was like, Ariel Sharon deciding how he wanted stuff to be.
Well, can I just add something? The disengagement also, it was something that was like widely encouraged by like the UN. Like it was like after Israel did it was like applauded in the UN, and like all these countries being like, you did the right thing, you made a step towards peace. So you could say that.
Because I know that because it like was like sort of not very democratically decided.
Yeah, that's
for sure. Yeah, definitely not. But it did please the nations.
So I think
that's universalistic.
I think it did. It was sort of a victory for the more universalistic Israelis, but it was also part of participating in the community of nations and the sort of global community. And I think in that sense, was a step towards universalism.
I mean, I don't know. As a Smolani, like I'm not I'm not particularly thrilled in retrospect with what happened with the disengagement, because the disengagement was it was a move by a right-wing politician, very, very fast in a sense, not very well thought out in terms of its execution. So yes, it was in the sense of we're giving land to the Arabs. Okay, you can call it a left-wing idea, but I think that like real left-wing universalism is more a framework of some sort of peace deal which is more well thought out and is something which works.
Well,
And
like
clearly, I mean, but clearly people on the left wing who say that any second that Israel is occupying any land that can exist, they clearly would disagree with you, right? They don't want to wait for a.
Right, I mean, I'm a utilitarian left winger, not
right.
a.
So
not
I mean,
a-
you may be
not
sort
a-
of not the.
Okay, but those are the people that give up their Israeli citizenship, and like I don't see why they
Just
should be
now,
like.
yeah.
Let,
Yeah.
No,
I'm
I'm
thinking of someone else.
Okay, but so I think
We all know who.
I think
I mean, or like I met these people who came from America who like had this protest about like at Kikar Davidka, and they're like, we don't even believe in like having a Jewish Zionist state. And I was like, in my head, like, well, like then like, why do you expect Israelis to listen to you? Like, what the like? How are you thinking that like you're convincing people when you're like you shouldn't exist?
yeah. So just to quickly respond to your point, I think he's not really setting up a broader framework for how this might look, so much as trying to almost digest the disengagement. Like, this happened, what now? What should we make of it? And I think he sees it as a step towards a more left-wing vision. And I think also many people did at that time. It's definitely vast sections of the left and right of Israel have been less than thrilled with how it's worked out on all number of fronts and how it was done and all kinds of things like that.
I mean, they voted for Olmert right after this. Whose whole platform was like, two-state solution. So
yeah, there was a sort of moment in Israeli history around that time that was the phrase "Medinat kol ezrachecha," the state of all its citizens, as opposed to the Jewish state. That was where we're going. We're going towards the state of all its citizens, and Israeli politics has moved just the opposite direction since then. We've basically had a right-wing government for as long as certainly I've been following Israeli politics.
Well, maybe you can say that really did happen in response to the fallout of the disengagement. Because at first, if the disengagement happens, even if people are against it, once it happens, I can see lots of people saying, all right, well, it happened. Let's hope this is a move more towards more, pluralism and acceptance and all, right? So then they were like, okay, great. So we'll move in that direction. But then once it doesn't continue that way.
Yeah. You also at some point get the rise of Bayut and the religious Zionist political bodies that's happened more recently.
although I think that there was always a religious Zionist party.
Yeah, but it's
no,
become...
like the NRP, they had internal issues, so sort of weren't really able to be around and a force because of internal things.
Yeah, the Bayut was the first serious contender. In many ways, they take up a serious block on the coalition.
Question.
Yes.
Did Rav Shagar truly believe in the effectivity of politics to bring about change?
I don't know. He definitely thought politics are here. He thought they were here. You should work with it. The drasha I mentioned that he gave at Yom Ha'atzmaut before the Hitnatut for the disengagement, it basically ends with a call for the establishment of what he calls a religious prophetic left-wing party, and he references Mapai and kind of dismisses it. And he says we need a sort of
the old Mapai?
I think so.
But that's not.
Okay, I'm just wrong.
Mapai.
There we go.
Yeah, I was okay.
Yeah, no, not.
Because Mapai was, Ben Gurion, and it's
Yeah, political history is not my strong suit. Okay, so rephrase. He references Meimad and sort of dismisses it as not really committing enough, not carrying the flag of religious ethical values. He thinks the left has stolen ethical discourse away from the religious community and there needs to be a religious left that he calls prophetic. And he doesn't give any sort of vision for what that should look like.
Like Heschel?
What? That's definitely something of there. He doesn't have any sense of like Heschel's prophetic call model.
I mean, but that just like something.
When I went to a merits meeting last year, so Ilan Gilon cited a lot of things from the Demon Ktuvim.
That's cool.
I think like Amos, Hosea, and Micha or something.
Oh yeah, they're really, really popular.
Cool.
Amos is really popular for communists.
Yeah, well, you know, socialism.
I don't think
whatever.
merit is the
also.
religious part.
It's not.
But they can be. If more religious people would.
No, they are.
Maybe they'll get cured by Amos and Zachariah, and all of merits will become religious.
No, they are in that sense the Jewish party. It's I think going back to Rav Shagar's language, where he says here, what matters is what justifications are brought for these compromises. The fact that Meretz quotes psukim in the midst of their meetings and discussions and whatever is, I think, very significant. That their language is Jewish language, and as opposed to they just came in the name of like Western liberal democratic values.
They do that a lot.
No, they're doing that too. I'm not denying that.
Mostly that.
But the question of degrees. But the fact that they're quoting psukim is, I think, significant.
Yeah.
Jesse.
No, or what's her name?
Two things. One, going back to Eitan's original question about something beyond postmodernism and the thoughts of Rav Shagar and sort of a stepping stone or evolution out of that. We started talking about another sort of deviated from.
Yeah. So I don't. Okay. Before I get to that, something else that. Ethan, you guys about politics? What do you thought about politics? Okay. So I was saying in the middle, saying I don't know. However, I just heard that they are working on and going to release soon a book on his political thought. So like of his political writings. So I will get back to you. Okay. As to the something past postmodernism. I don't think he necessarily envisioned anything else. He does talk a lot about, when it comes to messianism, what he's looking for is not a specific vision in the future, is in fact the opposite. Simply the willingness to have things be radically different. Like we talked about in one of the previous sections here, that like we get very stuck in our way of thinking about things, and he thinks that, he quotes Rabbi Nachman, that Mashiach and Eretz Yisrael are all connected to Chidush HaOlam, the creation or renewal of the world. That creation, he talks about the redemption. He has places here and there where he talks about the Messianic era specifically in terms of like peace in the Middle East and world peace and things like that. But on the whole, what he's looking for when he talks about any sense of the future Messianic era is just willingness to recognize that a sort of future utopia could be radically different than everything we think about our lives now. That the way we're used to things is not the way they have to be or even necessarily should be in any sort of ultimate sense. But I don't know any specific statements about here's what might happen after postmodernism.
Yeah. The other is the quotation marks around narrative.
Those are in the original.
Huh?
Yes, sorry.
Those are or not?
They are in the original.
And your understanding the quotations around narrative?
He's just using that in order to say, I'm invoking this popular term, narrative.
Okay.
Also,
I don't remember the Hebrew. It might even say narrative, just in Hebrew letters.
Narrative is a connotation of falsehood. So.
Well, narrative has a connotation in postmodernist discourse. This is what he's invoking here.
No, narrative is what gives meaning.
Narrative is the connotation of it's subjective. So if he believes this is the truth, that might be why he's not. It's not really a narrative, it's actually the truth.
Not in postmodern discourse. In postmodern discourse, there is no truth, there's only narrative. So narrative isn't false,
is he
because
so
false
steeped
requires...
in postmodern discourse that he actually believes that?
So, once again, we talk about this idea of the reality test. Your belief, your narrative, has to stand the test of reality. However, there are things for which you can't prove or know empirically that you might disagree with, but he would certainly affirm that.
Like who has a stronger connection to Israel?
And
us.
and for that he really does invoke Rav Kook for the questions of ethics and values and belief and morality. He invokes Rav Kook. Rav Kook talks about God as Echad HaKolel, Kol HaKolel, the all-inclusive. God includes everything. Every possible narrative is divine. That's how he affirms pluralism is because not in the way pluralism, really sort of relativism is generally found in the West, as no one really has any sort of true ideas, nothing's meaningful, everything is false, but everything is divine, so everything is true in some sort of sense of being divine. And I mean, it's a radically different way of thinking about truth and stuff.
If everything is true, then why does the Torah say to kill people who violate Shabbos? Can't they say their understanding of Shabbos is different? I don't know. It's a question on Rav Kook, not on Rav Shagar, so you don't know how to answer it.
That's definitely a question on Rav Shagar. I don't think Rav Kook would have said that. Rav Kook, so Rav Kook does talk about it. Rav Kook talks about tolerance. He says tolerance, as a political, not theoretical belief, as how you treat people, not whether you think they're right or wrong. He says we can tolerate really any belief anywhere amongst any nations except the Jews. The Jews have to have some sort of dogma. It's in letter 20, I think. But the only Jewish dogma, though, he says, is that the Jews exist to proclaim one idea, which is the oneness of God. So that's the whole reason the Jewish people exists, and anyone who denies that or doesn't believe in the oneness of God is inherently attacking the Jewish people based on that. At least any Jew who believes that. However, that is going with the incredibly mystical and expansive and inclusive model of God that Rav Kook is talking about. So I honestly thought about today, would have trouble imagining what exactly would deny the idea of the all-inclusive panentheistic God of Rav Kook, but there's theoretically something. Rav Kook does not make the shift towards truth claims that Rav Shagar does. Notably, Rav Kook is actually pretty machmir in terms of most things halakhically.
Even art.
Even art, yes.
Even though there's the Oregon News and the Oregon.
Yeah. An interesting article written recently by an Israeli woman whose name I've forgotten, where she goes through Rav Kook's approach to art in various passages. He seems to have been fairly positive about written verbal art, fairly negative for the most part, though occasionally just ambivalent about visual art. Despite he has this passage about Rembrandt. One of Rembrandt's paintings he saw, and he says, God made this light at the beginning of creation and hid it away so that the wicked people would not see it. But Rembrandt saw it.
No, it's really, it's in an interview in the London Jewish Chronicle, because he was stuck there during World War I, and the guys, and the interviewer is like, I met this interesting rabbi who had this to say about art.
No, he's looking it was a pretty good picture.
But that's an anomaly.
Right.
The rest of
art. So, any other sort of questions on this?
He goes back to saying Arab instead of Palestinians.
Well, I think that means that he meant the former. He meant they call themselves Palestinians. Because here he's calling them Arabs.
That's possible, or it's just colloquial. I wouldn't necessarily lean into that explanation, but it's definitely possible.
Question why he would switch using.
No, but that's what I'm saying. One of the options he gave for why he said Palestinians.
Not millions. Or if you're really being average, hundreds of millions.
No, if we're talking about the people who live in Gaza, that's hundreds of millions.
He's talking about the people who are, we're arguing in the state of Israel, Yehuda Shomron, Gaza.
Still millions.
Okay, so...
No, but not all Arabs who live here are Palestinians, right? Some of them are...
Also, maybe they're not all mad.
I think...
Our portion of them who are here. And our portion who might be very peaceful with us.
I think we can forgive him on the numbers in case he was not being specific.
Was this written as an essay or as a speech? Written later?
As an essay. So that's actually one of the interesting things about this. They've now released 9 or 10 volumes, I think, of Rav Shagar's writings. The vast majority of those are things they put together from his notes that he made himself before a class, students' notes about the class. They is the Institute for the Writings of Rav Shagar, and their head, their team. They have a variety of editors. As far as I'm aware, all of them are students. There might be some other friends and people who are involved. His very close friend in Chavruta, Rav Dreyfus, was involved in the project at the beginning and then moved on. but the people, the students, they put together the things that are published. They are in many ways exactly what he wrote, but in many ways presumably not.
Wait, so are we gonna have like a Shmonek with scene like situation like
so,
in 50 years?
I would love that. There is a there's a page on their website where they say at some point in the future we're going to upload like scans of all of the notes and things that we have to this page. I mentioned that to someone who said, probably right after they're done selling the last book, because, I mean, they're trying to sell books right now. So it could be quite a while.
But that's fair, because in some ways it's very transparent.
Yeah.
Like, these are the books, and this is what we've edited and compiled.
Yeah, they also...
No, I mean, like,
notes,
words and, like,
like,
Ratzi Yehuda was, like, very,
Yes, so I think part of what's at issue is certainly also what you choose to publish and how and things like that. So certain students who are in charge of editing and publishing certain books will emphasize his existential aspects and his connection to Rabbi Nachman, and certain people are going to emphasize his postmodernism, his interest in Derrida and Lacan and other French thinkers. One second. Sure. So in terms of, so they're putting out all of these things he wrote. Most of it, the most ready any of it was stuff that he wrote to speak from. He wrote like a page to speak from that when he presented.
but he never
this
wrote
essay,
essays to like appear in like
this essay is one of the few that is fairly unique. Every now and then he wrote things that appeared in various religious Zionist periodicals, usually religious ones. Interestingly, he has a couple of things that were published in religious Zionist poetry journal called Mashiach HaRuach. But this one was one of a couple that he published right around the time of Hitnakut that were not. They were in Hatzofeh, which is a religious Zionist journalism periodical. He turned with this piece not to the scholarly class in religious Zionism, not to people who are specifically interested in Torah discourse. This was written for the religious Zionist community writ large. He seems to have hit a point where he not only wanted to speak to whoever wanted to listen, but he wanted to turn to the broader community with what he thought were really critical things to say.
Did he write also stuff after the assassination of David?
Nothing that I've seen. Presumably yes, but at that point in time he was, I believe, teaching in Beit Morashah, which is a sort of interesting religious institution. I, though, have not seen any of those things.
Question.
Yes.
Have we finished with this?
Yeah. Well, I don't think I'm not going to do the fourth section.
Okay. So I have to go very soon, but I just want to ask before I left.
Yeah.
I'll ask. Rav Shagar. I think Rav Shagar. Got it. Okay. So this also applies to Rav Kook. But as someone who keeps a journal, okay, I question whether if, I'm not saying I will be a Rav Kook or Rav Shagar, but let's say someone like them who kept a journal at some point did become Rav Kook or Rav Shagar, ask them to keep a journal. I know that not all the things I write in the journal I continue to believe 10 days later. So just, I question, I don't know if ethics is the right word, but the efficiency of taking someone's journal and sort of arbitrarily, without any direction from the guy who wrote the journal, pulling that out into teachings from that person as if they believe everything they wrote.
So what you have by both Rav Kook and Rav Shagar, which I think functions as sort of permission to engage in the otherwise problematic practice that you're describing, is that both of them said, publish this.
Oh, okay. That's different.
They didn't target specific passages necessarily, or Rav Shagar didn't necessarily say, publish this and that and whatever. Rav Kook is a whole interesting story of what he's publishing and what he's not. There's one point in time when Rav Yehuda is traveling, so Rav Kook quickly publishes something that he thinks his son won't be happy with. Archulei Tohar. And sort of, actually have a friend who is releasing a book of translations of Rav Kook, and he, one of the things he talks about in his section on there is Rav Kook specifically attempted to publish things that, passages from his diaries where he talks about his own flaws. He seems to have thought that was a valuable thing to publish, which is interesting. So Rav Shagar He basically took like a disk on key, like a flash drive with all of his notes and stuff on it, and handed it to his students and close friends and people he trusts and said, publish this. He actually, for the Likutei Moharan lectures that were released, he asked for a specific person to be in charge of that. Wow. Though I was just going through that, though, and it does highlight some of the problematicness that you're talking about, which is things change over time. So, like one lecture in there will be put together from a lecture he gave in 82 and a like passage he wrote in a notebook in 94, and then another speech he gave in 2005. And sometimes that's fine, and sometimes that is kind of weird, and you'll sort of notice that it changes drastically in terms of not necessarily style, because they have editors to help make the style sort of streamlined, but certainly the content of what he's saying or quoting or whatever.
But the thing is, if you give a public speech, then you can't be upset that people are going to write down what happened, what you said in the speech, because you gave it publicly. You're letting people know that you said it.
Of course,
right,
but then you also have the chance.
shared with other things because it's out of context.
Right. So definitely, I agree. The date is a huge indicator.
So yeah, like while it is perhaps problematic, they're putting together things from widely different dates. I can tell you that because they do you the service of telling you that they're doing it. And in fact, some of the Rav Shagar books have gone through a process of development as they went from like the yeshiva putting out small 70-page books to like serious books coming out 400 pages long and stuff like that. And they now tell you not just like what year the thing was said or was put together from. Like also, it's like, okay, so this one was put together from 3 speeches from these years, and this one, like speech A dealt with this aspect of the topic, speech B with this aspect, and like so they're really doing their best. That, as much as the things I just said were sort of suspicious sounding of the Mechona Ketavim, they really put their effort in to be on the table about what they're doing. They want to release a readable product. That Rav Shagar wanted his writings to be released, but they're not readable the way he left them.
Did he like edit or overlook any? Like, did any of them come in his lifetime?
Yes. A volume on Purim, 2 volumes on the Emunah Ra'im and Teshuva, and a volume on the Sugya of Kiddush Hashem in Masechet Sanhedrin, and a volume called Kelim Shvurim that was on postmodernism and Zionism and stuff more generally. It was then re-edited and released in a much better form in Luchot Shivrei Luchot. So all of those were released in his time.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Whenever people post stuff from Luchot to Shivrei HaLuchot, I'm like, that sounds like stuff I write in Kelim Shvurim, because that's what my midrash had.
Yeah.
And, okay, so it's the same thing. Okay.
Basically, yeah.
That makes sense now.
All right, well, I have to go, but thank you so much. Like,
Yeah.
This was really great. If we keep doing things like this,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I actually.
Can I keep this also?
Yeah, go for it. Anyone wants to go and keep it? Anyone still have other things you want to talk about? Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova.
Shabbat Shalom.
So,
I have one of them.
Okay, yeah, Dina?
I mean, this is sort of like, this whole idea of like the reality test, or like if something happens that maybe it's like a call for like ideological teshuva or like reconsideration and all of that. Like, do you think that would be a good thing to apply to when people, like religious leaders, do something wrong, like the Karloff people who like refuse to accept that there are very strong indications that he was a sexual predator?
I think there's definitely a connection. Like, I don't know how strong a statement I would want to make, just in terms of the like details of any given situation. But I think rabbinic, or sort of the idealization of a specific human being is very parallel to that sort of ideology thing we were talking about before. And that you can think that a person is wonderful, and they might really be. But hopefully you think they're wonderful because they really are. But people are fallible the same way like everything is fallible. So I would definitely say he would think in terms of this general sense of openness in terms of your narrative, that like willingness to hear new facts, that I think the argument he's perfect so he couldn't have done that is incredibly problematic. You're saying my understanding of him overrules potential new facts, and that's not how it should be. That's what he's arguing against.
Like it can be like a very big trauma when, like I just, like also, or like with the material, like the girls in like some of them were just like crying, and like didn't know what to do.
I know people who were close to Moti alone, and it was
and like they had like then had this very intense like stuff to help them.
But so I think that there's a broader question there, which is, I mean, the way that he's presenting it and the way that like Rav Kook and I think that religious Zionists think about things, that they see meaning in history, right? They think that not just that there's a reality that we have to contend with, but the fact that this history happened, meaning that God has a message for us that's told through the history and through what's happening. As opposed to like a normal, like non-religious pragmatist who would say, well, obviously I live in reality, I'm constantly dealing with reality and I have to deal with whatever new situation arises, but there isn't necessarily meaning there, right? I mean, like I learn principles from reality, but it's not, there's something that's being filtered down and telling me things.
So Rav Shagar is a little complex when it comes to questions of like what is Hashgacha Pratit and how does that work, and or Hashgacha, divine providence in general. Just like, for example, the first essay that they've published that is or like drasha that's specifically dealing with the Hitnakut is from Purim, right before the disengagement. The official decision was made in the Knesset in like January or February of 2005. So Purim is not long afterwards. And there he says explicitly, God's will is meaningless. Not does not have any meaning for our life, but in the sense that meaning is a human thing. And the idea of saying God has a specific thing in mind is like nonsense in the Maimonidean sense. Like it just doesn't mean anything. It is a weird thing to say about God. He sort of does not necessarily make that strong a statement in some other places, but that does raise the question of what does he mean when he says Hitnakut happened, so that should maybe change how we look at things. So one of the book of Drashot on Hanukkah, ends with a afterword from the editor, specifically focusing on the question of Hashgacha, of divine providence, and Rav Shagar's thought. And he actually has like 3 or 4 slightly different models that Rav Shagar deals with, several of them based on the thought of French psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan. The common theme throughout those models that the student and editor is pointing out is that none of them assume there's some sort of plan. That the idea that God has a plan separate from reality is sort of strange. That God's will is not something separate from reality. Reality, like, is the thing itself of God's will. There's not a sort of chronological. First, there's God's will, and then there's the development in reality. And that is something that I honestly have trouble like understanding what those words mean sometimes. But it's very clear that there's no sort of overall plan, idea God is trying to get you to get. That, in a certain sense, God's providence lives or dies based on whether or not you get it. That Rav Shagar is avoiding that idea. When he does raise the possibility that there are 2 possibilities that I can think of from there that would lead to this conclusion we see here. One is that reality has no specific meaning. There's no divine plan that you're supposed to figure out, so much as it's just full of meaning. And we are supposed to take meaning from it, even if we're not supposed to be attributing sort of objectivity to that meaning. And I think, in a certain sense, a little more concretely, another possibility is that it's weird to separate ourselves from reality. That there's us and there's reality, and we have to interpret reality. Instead, Rav Shagar sometimes argues, we are a part of reality. Our interpretations of the things that happen to us are a function of that reality. And so as much like divine providence is not just the things that happen to us, it's also in how we understand them.
Right. But so if I have to decide whether I'm going to be right wing or left wing on Israeli politics, right? So how does Rav Shagar's whole approach help me with that? Because if there's no meaning in the events that I'm observing, right? So I was right wing before, and so so the disengagement happened, but I could still be right wing and interpret it as so this is a bad thing that happened according to my worldview. I want to prevent things like this from happening in the future, but it shouldn't change necessarily the way that I think about things unless you think that there's meaning to it.
I'm not sure. I think the stages sort of this argument that we've gone through today are like there is a broadening gap between the specific way of thinking about the state as redemptive and messianic and the facts on the ground. You should be open to the fact that when your beliefs are contradicted by reality, you be open to that possibility that your beliefs might be contradicted by reality, and then that you should change your beliefs.
I'm not saying that the disengagement means people should be left wing.
No. So here he talks about the possibility that left wing ideas like globalism are actually present messianic utopian options.
Right, but he doesn't say
other places he says that.
Oh, in other places
like
he says that.
Like I mentioned, he talks about the need to create a left-wing party, a religious, prophetic left-wing party.
He says that the disengagement is
Okay,
a
but
reason why we should think that.
No, so I will say one of his students presented at one of the each year on his yard site the Yeshiva Tziyach Yitzchak, his yeshiva has done a day of classes. And so one of them, Eitan Abramowitz, who is also one of the editors of some of the books, spoke about exactly that issue of is this argument that he's making here just a reaction to the disengagement? And Eitan argues that no. You look at the earliest books they published, of the Drashot I mentioned earlier from when he's at Yeshiva HaKotel, they have this same sense of lack of satisfaction with physical, physical, very nationalistic redemption, political redemption. There is development, and I think the Hitnakut, the disengagement, really seals the deal for him on some of the problematic aspects. So he has a speech from 2002, 2003, where he talks about the fact that it's strange that the modern nation state is our idea of redemption, that the modern nation state is based on war and power and things like that. He quotes a phenomenal piece from Rav Kook that some of his students have said that he quoted relatively regularly, often enough. Rav Kook says that the Jewish people were forced off the stage of history mitoch ones sheyesh bo ratzon pnimi, through force and compulsion that had an inner will. And Rav Kook goes on to talk about war being a bad thing. The stage of history is a stage of warfare, and we didn't want to participate. So we were forced off the stage. The Churban happened, that was bad, but there is a sort of inner will there. That's something that's not bad. And Rav Shagar quotes that and is talking about how the state of Israel is a modern nation state as part of the framework of nations that fight each other and participate in the sales of arms. And how do we think the state of Israel is messianic if it's selling arms? So that's already beyond where he is in the 80s, without a doubt. But then in some of the stuff from around the time of the Hitnakut is where you find him saying, law is inherently violent. He quotes Walter Benjamin's Critique of Violence he's quoting it from Eric Santner's book, The Psychotheology of Everyday Life. But they talk about the idea that inherently in making laws, you're going to have the state has power over people that is inherently violent power. If people do not obey the law, there will be a violent response. So the disengagement seems to really seal the deal for him on thinking that the modern nation state is a possibly sort of messianic option, that it could be the end. I think he really did get a sense of we need a more universalistic other possibility, that what we have now is somehow inherently based on violence and is therefore cannot be the final stage of history in any sense.
Wait, what does he mean when he says left wing? What does he mean?
In what context? You mean when I say he wants to make a left wing party? Or?
Yes.
Unclear. Like he sort of uses it as like a throwaway line. And
I mean, like, does that mean he wants to make a religious party that's like dedicated to strongly pursuing a two-state solution? Is that, or like one that is like left-wing on social issues, or?
So definitely social issues. He was active with Mago Tzedek, which I don't know if it's still around, but it was certainly at one point a religious Zionist social activism group. He there's a book on social justice, an essay on social justice at the end of L'chot Teshuva L'chot, where he actually talked about the need for systemic change, which is something I had not otherwise seen a rabbi talking about. And so definitely social issues, and he talks about that in some of his various pieces that talk about the Messianic era and what we want when we talk about Mashiach. His like social activism at the heart of that. He's been very bothered by the like inherently aggressive competition that seems to come along with modern capitalism, and the like hatred of the other that's inherent in that. And it comes to questions of two-state solution and things, I don't know. He has various statements about like what he'd be looking for. So here he's talking about compromise. Here he's talking about compromise. In another piece from around the Disengagement, a little after, he's talking about a Jerusalem as a city for all nations, where you stand side by side with the other in his otherness, meaning the Arab Palestinian who thinks their right to the land is stronger than yours, and you stand side by side. In none of these places does he really present a clear picture for how that might look. Maybe that'll be in his political thought book they're going to release. I don't know.
How can you be a left wing on social issues and also be a libertarian? It's a contradiction.
Not necessarily. So the
whatever left wing policies you want to advocate for will be enforced with a state that can sometimes
right.
Violence.
So there's definitely some degree of tension there. I'm not sure I would call him a libertarian. I think he was all. I also think he's not necessarily calling for like top-down social justice movements and things that like the government should be taking care of everyone. In the essay I mentioned on social justice, he specifically calls for a sort of bottom-up initiative.
But then why do you need a political party for it? You don't need a political party, you just need an organization.
No, but there is the politics is real, and so we should be shaping our politics.
Oh, okay.
If he's so into existentialism, does he ever quote or like?
Sartre and Camus show up. Sartre and Camus show up frequently. Started saying that, and the Kusker Rebbe, definitely sometimes.
Or Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard a little bit. He definitely never read Kierkegaard inside. He doesn't seem to have read much outside of Hebrew. He read a work called, I think, just Dialogic Philosophy, by Shmuel Bergman, or Hugo Shmuel Bergman, and that he learned Kierkegaard there. He also specifically, I think you mentioned Kusker, he's very into Ishbitz and Rotzadok. And he specifically references the Ishbitzer as an existentialist. Does that address your question more? I actually took a class on the Meheshilo with one of his students, and the whole project of the course was a very existentialist reading of Meheshilo, and it seems to have come from Rav Shagar's way of understanding that. So just to quickly sort of sum up, what I wanted to get to at the end of that third piece was also in terms of not just the overall political picture, the specific image for Teshuva is the sense of my narrative is not all there is, that willingness to hear new things, while it's not really holding on to your narrative. You shouldn't be like throwing out your identity entirely. You need to have some sort of identity, but you need to recognize that it's not absolute, and be sort of willing to hear new things and be open to a process of growth and renewal.
So was he like into like Rav Froman's way of talking with every kind of Palestinian leader?
I think he was not as involved. He and Rav Froman seem to have been close. But then two of them were certainly involved in a lot of the same project of introducing Chassidut into the land of Israel and the religious Zionist community.
Because the Gerperman was also like, it
Yeah.
doesn't hurt me to talk to the head of Hamas. Like, he's a nice religious guy. I'm a nice religious guy.
Yeah, so Rav Furman is a fascinating figure. I just got the new book that Maggid released on the Chagim for his stuff. But he seems to have been very involved in politics. And Rav Shagar was a very yeshiva-focused figure. Rav Shagar taught all of his life. He actually thought of his Gemara teaching as his primary sort of involvement. So, like, I just don't think he was involved in the project in the same way as Rav Furman. I don't think he was necessarily for or against it in any significant sense. Anything else? I thank you guys for coming. That's great.
So when are we going to have the Nobody Cares What You Think?